Hey, welcome back to the Logan Cabinet Shop. I'm Bob Berzieski. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Hand Tools and Techniques. You know, a common question on the hand tool message boards from new woodworkers and experienced power tool users looking to incorporate more handwork into their projects is, where do I start? What tools do I really need? And this can be a pretty subjective question because it really depends a lot on how much you want to do by hand and how much you're going to do with power tools. But there are a few hand tools that really deserve a place in every shop, regardless of how much you do by hand and how much you do by machine. So today, I'm going to give you my recommendations for a basic set of hand tools that no shop should be without. I classify tools into one of 5 general categories based on their job function: roughing tools, refining tools, shaping tools, joinery tools, and boring tools. Now I'm going to make my recommendations based on someone starting up a hand tool only shop. If you use a combination of hand tools and power tools in your shop, adjust your tool choices appropriately based on what operations you want to do by hand and what operations you want to do by machine. So let's start with the roughing tools. Now in a blended shop, you're probably doing your stock prep with a joiner, planer, and maybe a table saw or a bandsaw. So these aren't tools you're really going to need. But in a hand tool only shop, these are definitely tools you're going to need. The first is a crosscut saw. Now this saw is used for breaking down your long stock into shorter, more manageable lengths. Cutting things to rough dimensions. You can use it at the lumber yard for breaking long 16-foot boards down into shorter lengths so you can get them home. I like a saw. This one's about 26 inches long and about 8 points per inch. So the next saw is a rip saw. And this saw is for ripping boards or cutting along the grain, making wider boards into narrower boards. Again, I like a saw 26 to 28 inches long. This one happens to be about 5.5 points per inch. And there's actually some finer teeth up at the toe to help you start the cut. To take the surface of that rough sawn stock and start smoothing it out and dressing it and bringing it to thickness, you're going to need a 4-plane. Some folks call this a jack plane. It's about 14 to 18 inches long. I grind the iron with a pretty heavy camber, and the mouth on this plane is pretty wide. You really don't need a tight mouth on a jack plane or a 4-plane. This plane is designed to take thick shavings and remove stock in a hurry. In a blended shop, this isn't really something you're going to need because you're going to do that work with joiners and planers. So if you're working with power tools, doing your stock prep with joiners and planers, you can skip the jack plane. Alright, moving on to the refining tools. These are tools that take the rough surfaces left by the joiner and the planer or the 4-plane and make them flat and smooth and get them ready for joinery or for finishing. So we'll start with this big plane here. This is a tri-plane, also called the joiner plane. This is probably the first plane that I recommend that someone using power tools to do their rough work were to buy, rather than the more commonly recommended jack plane. This plane is typically 22 to 26 inches long, and the length of the sole is really its benefit, because the long sole is what helps you to make boards flat, and that's really the job of the tri-plane, is to make boards flat. I grind mine with a moderate camber, and I set it up to take shavings about the thickness of a piece of copy paper. The next plane is a smooth plane. These are typically 7 to 10 inches. Again, I don't grind a camber on this one per se, but I do relieve the corners on my stones. So I don't have a perfectly straight iron. I do relieve the corners back a little bit so the corners don't dig in when I'm planing. But I set this plane up to take a super thin shaving, like something like tissue paper that you would use for packing a box. This plane is designed to take those thin shavings. It has a tight mouth so that it can prevent tear out, and it's used for putting the final surface on a piece before finish, making it glassy smooth. The last tool that I have in the refining tool category are card scrapers. And these tools are fantastic for tough grain. Working something like tiger maple or maybe curly cherry, anytime you have reversing grain, spots that are difficult to get to with a smooth plane or spots that just don't plane well, a well-tuned card scraper is a really great tool to use. Very worth learning to use this tool. Alright, let's talk about shaping tools. These are tools used to shape any kind of curved surface. The first tool you're going to need in a hand tool only shop is a way to cut curves. I like a turning saw, also called a bow saw. It's tension with a cord, blade attaches between two pins, there's a center stretcher, and as we tighten the cord here, it puts more tension on the blade. It has a very thin blade, and it's used for cutting curved shapes. In a power tool shop, you're probably going to use a bandsaw for this, so that's probably not a tool you're going to need. Next, for refining those shapes, the spoke shave. This is a great tool for smoothing out convex surfaces. You can also use it for concave surfaces as long as the radius of the curve isn't too tight. Sort of like a plane, it has a blade and a sole just like a plane, but it's much shorter. You can push this tool or pull it. There are wooden versions available as well as metal versions. A pattern maker's rasp is the next tool. This is a Nicholson number 49. I like pattern maker's rasp as opposed to a cabinet maker's rasp because they're typically thinner and they're a little bit narrower and they taper a little bit more at the tip, allowing you to get into some tighter spaces. Also, the teeth on a pattern maker's rasp are finer than a cabinet rasp, which means it leaves a smoother surface behind, but it does still remove wood at a fairly quick pace. After the rasp, we would use a cabinet file. This is a half round cabinet file, flat on one side, half round on the other side, and it's used after the rasp to smooth out those surfaces, get them ready for a finish. Okay, so the next group of tools are the joinery tools, and this is a fairly large group of tools and probably the tools that most folks think about when they think about hand tools. So we'll take a few minutes to talk about the joinery tools because there's a lot of tools in this group. So let's start with probably the most important tools in the shop, and definitely the most important of the joinery tools, the layout tools. Square. You'll need at least one. I like to have several in different sizes. I have a 6-inch and a 9-inch here. I also have a 15-inch square. Tri-squares are my favorite. Some folks like combination squares, yet others like the all-steel engineer squares. Really personal preference, get one that you like. But definitely 1 or 2 squares. Again, I'm going to recommend 2, maybe like a 6-inch and a 12-inch, because it's nice to have shorter squares when you're working with smaller stock. Miter square, this is set at 45 degrees and used just for scribing 45-degree angles. Most combination squares have a 45-degree leg, so you kind of get a miter square and a combination square in one. A bevel square or sliding bevel. This tool is used to gauge angles and transfer them from one part to another. We don't really measure with this tool. There's no graduations on it. But it's great for transferring an angle from one part to another. I would definitely recommend getting at least one of these, potentially more. Gauges. Marking gauges are extremely important to have in the shop. I have several different. I've already had situations where I've had 3 on the bench at one time, all with different settings. So I definitely recommend you get at least 2 of them. The first, this is a combination marking and mortising gauge. One side has a single pin for marking a single line. The other side has one fixed pin and one adjustable pin that you can use to mark out a mortise. Another style of gauge, and this is a style that I made, but this is a single pin gauge, and I file the pins on the gauges that I make to sort of a knife point because they cut cross grain better. And you definitely need a gauge that can go cross grain when you're marking things like dovetail baselines. So I would say a marking gauge and a cutting gauge, or a combination marking mortising gauge and a cutting gauge, or you can make your own like I did, file a pin into sort of a knife shape. Speaking of knives, marking knife, extremely important. Put the pencils down, pick up a knife. Knife makes a much finer line than a pencil, and it also gives your tools, like your chisels and your saws, a place to register in the cut. I like a single bevel knife. That means it's flat on one side and has a bevel on the other side, just like a chisel. This one is also single skewed. I don't know if you can see it's skewed in this direction, made for right-handed use. There are also spear point knives, which are still single beveled knives, flat on one side, beveled on the other, but they're spear point, so they're kind of a double skew and they come to a point at the top. And you can use those left-handed or right-handed. There are double beveled knives, which are ground like a knife, with a bevel on both faces. I don't particularly like them because you need to angle them in order to mark a line. This one I can hold nice and vertical and get a good line. Pair dividers. This is a very underutilized tool, I think, but it's fantastic for transferring measurements. You know, a lot of folks will just use a tape measure and try and measure this and then transfer it to something else. The divider is great because you can gauge this piece and you already have that measurement set, you give it to another piece. Also, you can scribe arcs and circles with it, so definitely at least a pair of dividers. And of course you're going to need something to measure with. I use a simple folding rule. This is graduated down to 1/16 of an inch, and that's more than enough. You really don't need super precision rules. If you're going to work by hand, even if you're working by machine, the best way is to gauge parts off of each other rather than measuring. It's a lot more accurate to gauge than it is to measure. I use my ruler probably just in the beginning of a project for rough dimensioning, cutting things to rough size. But I really, once I have a basic case built, I really don't pick the ruler up again. Okay, next in the joinery tool group we have some saws. The first is a back saw, cross-cut back saw. And you'll use this saw for cutting things like tenon shoulders and cutting pieces to final length. This one is about 13 points per inch, filed cross-cut, and it leaves a nice smooth cut due to the nice fine teeth and very little set in the teeth. The next saw is a rip-filed back saw. I call it a tenon saw because I use it for cutting the cheeks of hand-cut tenons. This saw is about 12 inches. I like a saw anywhere from 12 inches to 16 inches and probably about 12 points per inch filed rip. Finally, if you're going to hand cut dovetails, nothing works better than a dovetail saw. You can certainly cut dovetails with your tenon saw, but a dovetail saw typically has a thinner saw plate and even less teeth, usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 and 19 teeth per inch, again filed rip, but it's designed for sawing thinner stock like drawer sides and case sides, so it has fewer teeth to leave a smoother finish behind. So if you're going to hand cut dovetails, you're probably going to want a dovetail saw. Okay, next in the joinery tools we have chisels, and chisels are constantly on my bench. I use them for all kinds of things, from chopping out the waist and dovetails, trimming tenon shoulders to make them fit nice and tight, all kinds of paring tasks to fit joinery. Chisels are probably the most used tools in my shop, so I keep them nice and sharp all the time. To start out, I would say get yourself a small set. I find myself using the smaller sizes most often, probably in the range of 1/4 to 3/8 and 1/2 inch are probably my most used sizes. So definitely look for a set with those three sizes, the smaller sizes in it. I also like to have one wider chisel, and this is great for pairing. Pairing drawboard pegs flush, or pairing off a tenon shoulder to make it fit nice and tight. So I keep one nice wide chisel that I don't hit with a mallet. I just use it for pairing. Speaking of mallets, if you're going to do chopping with your chisels, which you're going to hand cut dovetails and make mortises, you're going to chop with your chisels, you're going to need a mallet, simple wooden mallet, more than enough. If you're going to hand cut mortises, nothing beats a mortise chisel. These differ from the regular bench chisel because their blades are extremely thick and stout, because they're meant to stand up to the abuse of continuous hitting with a mallet and also prying, because once you drive that chisel in, you're typically going to pry those chips out, and a regular bench chisel would just snap. So if you're going to hand cut mortises, you're definitely going to want mortise chisels. There's really no better way to hand cut a mortise. Okay, so the last of the joinery tools we're going to talk about are a couple of joinery planes. In a shop where you're using power tools to do some of your work, these are tools you may not use, so you decide for yourself if you want to hand cut your joinery using these planes or your machines. So the first is a fenced rabbet plane. These are made in metal versions and wood versions. Stanley made two versions that I know of, the 78 and the 289. The difference being the 78 had a straight iron and the 289 had a skewed iron. I like this wooden version, also called the moving philister plane. It has an adjustable fence on the bottom that can adjust the width of the rabbet. And the iron is skewed, and the skewed iron helps make clean cross-grain cuts. Also, it has a nicking iron or a scoring iron, and this is used for cross-grain rabbeting to score across the grain to leave a nice, neat shoulder. If you want to plow grooves for drawers or door panels, you're going to need a plow plane. This plane, again, has a moving fence so that you can plane your grooves at a particular distance away from the edge of the board. It also has a depth stop, although this one doesn't really work so well. Most plow planes have a depth stop more like this brass depth stop on the moving philister plane. And these typically came with a set of irons graduated in 1/16 of an inch, from about 1/8 of an inch wide to about 9/16 of an inch. You don't usually find them with the entire set. Usually you have to buy the set of irons separately. The plow plane probably just has one iron left in it. But again, these are great planes for plowing a groove for something like a drawer bottom or a door panel. If you want to plow a groove, you need a plow plane. And the last joinery plane that I'm going to talk about today is for making dados. It's a dado plane. What is a dado? It's basically a groove, a cross-grain groove in the middle of a board. So not on an edge, across, the center. Similar to the rabbet plane, this one has nicking iron. And if you can see this one actually has a spur on either side to score both sides of the dado. Also has a skewed iron, because since a dado is a cross-grain cut, the skewed iron makes that cut nice and clean. And again, similar to the plow and the rabbet, it has a depth stop so that when you get to the depth of the dado that you want, the plane stops cutting. Alright, so the last group of tools we're going to talk about today are the boring tools, and these are tools for boring holes. There are two basic types of boring tools that I use, a brace and a bit, and that's for boring holes 1/4 inch and larger. And I use an egg beater drill. Braces come in a lot of different styles. The most common, a ratcheting chuck brace like this. A great benefit of these braces is that they can be used in tight places where you can't make a full revolution. So you can bore and then ratchet back and bore and ratchet back. Slightly older style brace is this gentleman's brace. This one just has a tapered square hole for the bit and a set screw to hold the bit in place. The bit doesn't hold as securely as it does in a ratcheting chuck brace, but this is just another type of brace that is possible. And the third type of brace is a wooden brace like this one, and this is probably the oldest style of the three that I have here. Again, a tapered hole for the bit to fit in, and a little locking lever to release it. These braces typically came with a set of bits. You're not going to find them with a set of bits nowadays, and if you do, the collectors are going to drive the prices up. But I find that really they typically hold good enough, even if the catch doesn't engage in a notch in the originals. Bits for the brace, I use just standard Jennings auger bits. These have a lead screw that pull the bit into the wood so you don't have to push down on it. There's a spur on either side that scores the outer edge of the hole to make it nice and clean. And then there's a cutting edge on either side in front of the spur that then removes the chips and forms the hole. For making smaller holes, for pilot holes for nails or screws, I use an egg beater drill. This is just like the egg beater mixers that you see all over antique stores, except there's a drill chuck on the end. And this drill just uses regular old twist bits. So those are my recommendations for a basic set of tools to get started in a hand tool shop. Again, if you're a blended woodworker, just choose the tools that you'll need to perform the task that you want to do by hand. Now obviously, we've only begun to scratch the surface of the hand tools that are available. I haven't touched on tools like molding planes, carving chisels, or turning tools, but these aren't really tools you're going to need to get started. Add them to your collection as your skills and your projects dictate. Also, I didn't mention tools like hammers and screwdrivers, but you're going to need some of those as well. Finally, sharpening equipment, I didn't mention that at all, and it is something that you're going to need. But sharpening is a topic that deserves an entire episode to itself, so we'll cover that another time. So that's it for this episode. Thanks again for joining me. We'll see you next time for more hand tools and techniques.
Thanks for watching.